we're looking at Milton's, some of Milton's sonnets here today, and just one brief excursion into his minor poems, and then we're going to get into the major poems, which will occupy our attention for the rest of the course. Trying to devote the majority of my time to that, and because they are complex and rich and need more explanation, quite frankly. I don't think the sonnets are that difficult, but they are worthy of attention. They are written in a form unlike those, many of the forms that he has tackled thus far. It is not an ancient literary form, unknown in the classical world. The sonnet is an invention of the Italian Renaissance. Francesco Petrarch normally being attributed the honor of having invented the form. A sonnet, some say, means a little room, but it's a 14-line poem, and written with 2 parts in general: an octave, the 8-line sequence at the beginning, and a sestet, a 6-line conclusion. So it's written in terms of 2 parts or 2 movements, and in between them there is a volte, or a turn. That's the technical term, the volte. So there's a twist, if you will, goes in another direction. So that allows for there to be a little, even in a lyric poem, which is what it is, a short lyric poem, a little bit of variety introduced there. It's a form that is adopted by English poets as well, many of which could be mentioned here, but the most famous of which are probably Spenser and Shakespeare, preceding Milton, Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare. Shakespeare makes the sonnet sequence his own and probably prides himself most for his sonnets rather than his theatrical productions. We esteem his drama. Like most writers of his era, and probably all the way until the 20th century, they would much prefer to be regarded as poets rather than as dramatists, or let alone novelists. The novel is a novel literary form, as the term suggests. And it is held in great suspicion, or at any rate with a fair bit of disdain, by the great writers of the 18th century. They might delve into the novel, but they don't want to be chiefly associated with it. It's aimed at a popular audience, not a literate audience, and so and the sorts of readers who are reading novels are not particularly highly regarded by the authors. Now, I think that changes over the course of time, but still. But Milton's not writing any novels because the form doesn't even exist, if for no other reason. He is writing poetry, and this is one of the forms he's going to try and master. The lyric poem is one of the 5 that the classical world recognizes, and this is a type of lyric poem, if you will. But as I say, a Renaissance form. Now, you know yourselves from Petrarch and Dante and others that it begins with associations with the courtly love tradition. So it's associated with love lyrics. And Shakespeare does not deviate from that. He knows those are the expectations. So forms have certain conventions and associations that a poet inherits when he writes those forms, and that his audience expects. And you can use that to your advantage. You either can follow the conventions, and you can make stronger emphases than the foregoing writers did, or you can play with the conventions, write it in an ironic fashion, or even reverse the expectations of it. The Italian Renaissance poets are, when they write about love, they almost only mean it in the modern materialistic sense, sexual, erotic love. The English Renaissance, on the other hand, is written in the wake of the Reformation, and so we get this dovetailing of two movements. Renaissance with respect to form, and there's a desire for classical forms, and classicism is an important part of the period, and Milton himself is a Renaissance man in the sense of his devotion to classical ideals. But they're also intensely theological, and see this as a preeminent concern even of the poet, for that matter, because poets are held to be teachers, and their work is being held in scrutiny by their puritanical age. You're not just entertaining, or delighting people, you are also teaching them, and there's a high responsibility for that. In my classical lit theory class, I talk about that with regard to Sir Philip Sidney, The Art of Poetry. He talks about the aim of the poet to teach and to delight, but the teaching is significant. And so when, although Shakespeare doesn't follow this and is more in the Renaissance mold, referring to erotic love in that sense, and isn't really interested in theologizing, Spenser and certainly Milton are. And so when they talk about love, they will be reflecting on the love of God, what C.S. Lewis calls agape love. This will become a prime consideration. And so when you read the sonnets of Donne, or when Herbert occasionally dips into the form, he will be reflecting on the relation of God's love for his people. And he will use the charged erotic conventions to toy with them. Right? So again, the form, as you can see, it develops and it allows for some richness and complexity there. And once the conventions have been played with, well, now you have new conventions. So it could be just about erotic love, or it could be related to theological, metaphysical themes. I mean, Donne in his holy sonnets pushes them in that direction. Later writers now can do both, do either. And even in terms of form, they have a wide variety of alternatives there to choose from when they're doing their own thing. So Milton, when he comes upon this, will be thinking, yes, Petrarch, yes, Shakespeare, but also, yes, John Donne. I've read Donne. And he will have that in mind. And one of the things he probably gained from Donne is the way he opens his sonnets. Almost like a trumpet blast. Very strong. Donne's holy sonnets, batter my heart, three-person God, for as you but knock, right? Donne typically begins his sonnet with a great force, breaking the meter right away. Because it tends to be written in pentameter, but it often begins with a trochee or usually a trochee. So the stress on the very first syllable and very emphatic. And we see that here as well. Captain or colonel. So again, the emphasis on the very first syllable. And he will do this in a wide variety of the poems or the sonnets. Lady, again. Oh, nightingale, a little less so. Oh, he writes that one in Italian. No, let's stick with the... Oh, no, he's translating. Okay, well, I'll just leave this. Oh, that's because I'm clicking from the Italian. Let's just stick with this so I don't get myself lost here. But you can see he's even writing in Italian, so of course he's read the Italian poems and is probably engaging with them as an Italian poet, such that when he, as I say, went on the tour to Italy, he was greeted as a great Italian poet even. It's rather extraordinary. But another sonnet writer, William Wordsworth, thought that Milton used the sonnet, and this was his words, as a trumpet. quote, a trumpet whence he blew soul animating strains. It's a trumpet to what? The soul. So there's something, patriotic themes. He's appealing to the human heart. He's certainly not appealing to the passions, let alone the bodily desires, as will be Petrarch and to some degree Shakespeare. He's got a different aim there. And so he begins there with that, and we'll see several of the sonnets here will be marked by that. But I will also say a second thing here, and John Leonard notes this as well. John Leonard, a really good critic, I think, and a fine ear for poetic form. Writes actually a handbook on poetic form, which I recommend. Notes that he often concludes with a quiet voice. And it's a little, I would say that becomes characteristic of Milton across the board. It begins in conflict and with great moment and a sense of grandeur, and yet concludes with a resolution of quiet conviction and resolve, and the conflict is settled. You'll see that in Paradise Lost. You'll see it in Paradise Regained as well, and even to some degree in Samson Agonistes. So it begins just like a sonnet by Donne begins with the clarion call of the trumpet, blasting, announcing a conflict, and then by the end of it all, the conflict has been resolved and peace ensues thereafter. Right? In Milton's Paradise Lost, of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree that brought death into our world and all our woe with loss of Eden. So it's a grand, big theme right at the beginning. And at the end, the pair, Adam and Eve, leave hand in hand with wandering steps and slow, and through Eden took their solitary way. It's a very subdued conclusion. Likewise, in Paradise Regained, the son returns to his mother's house, having withstood the temptations of the devil. He goes back home to mom. That's it. And paradise has been regained. Almost understated, the significance. And that fits Milton's grand theme that the world, the venue of so much physical conflict and fighting and noise. And remember, they had cannons in the English Civil War, brought them out horribly, making grand blasts and scenes of destruction and chaos. Ends up being blind and under house arrest, and writes in the quiet of that with his grand theme that the paradise within is happier far than the paradise without that was lost. Because Jesus is concerned with not just our external deeds, but also with our hearts above all. Our hearts need to be right. It doesn't mean that he is pushing pacifism, but it is saying that the first and foremost field of victory must be within. Anyway, here this poem, Sonnet 8, you can see the way, I don't know why it's been quite parsed out like this on the page. Again, I know this is an internet adaptation of it, so it puts gaps between the lines for reasons that I don't quite understand. But we see, roughly speaking, you see an octave and a sestet. So the first two, what are almost stanzas here, should be held together as one. So the octave, arms, cease, please, harms, A, B, B, A, charms, these, sees, warms. Again, same thing, A, B, B, A. So it's an octave. And then the sestet, same sort of thing. Bower, spare, tower, air, power, bear. Note there's no rhyme at the end, no rhyming couplet. This is not a Shakespearean sonnet. It's a Petrarchan sonnet in its form. Let me read it and then we'll just note a few salutary features about it. Captain or colonel or knight in arms, whose chance on these defenseless doors may cease, If ever deed of honor did thee please, guard them, and him within protect from harms. He can requite thee, for he knows the charms that call fame on such gentle acts as these, and he can spread thy name o'er lands and seas, whatever clime the sun's bright circle warms. Lift not thy spear against the Muses' bower. The great Emathian conqueror bids spare the house of Pindarus, whose temple and tower went to the ground, and the repeated air of sad Electra's poet had the power to save the Athenian walls from ruin bare. So he's speaking, and the context is given here by Shawcross in the first footnote here. During the earlier days of the First Civil War, the Royalist Army, after success at Edge Hill, the first battle of the war, on October 23rd, 1642, advanced toward London, but retreated November 19th or 12th and 13th. Milton's home in Aldersgate Street was just beyond the London City Gate, and he meant to tack the sonnet to the door of his house. So, context of war. There's a physical battle, and he, the poet, is within the gates of his house, while a physical battle is on his door, or on the wake of, or at the gates of the city of London. He is lying within. And what battle is being waged there, and what themes does this arise? Well, there's he effectively is talking about the far-reaching powers of poetry as compared to the inglorious limitations of war itself, to actually subdue its opponents. And this is a theme that's consistent in Milton. This is before the war. After the war, as I say, he defends Cromwell's Republican government. And then he writes Paradise Lost as in defeat, in to some degree humiliation, because Charles II returns. Some might say that his Paradise Lost and the theme of a paradise within happier far is the product of his dashed hopes in a republic. Right? So he's retreated to a sort of an inner pietism, and he's not concerned with liberty in a political sense anymore. He's only concerned with conscience, but he's not concerned with the freedom of assembly or the freedom of the press or the freedom of speech or any of those freedoms. He's retreated entirely. And so he's a defeated man. But we can see here, before the war even begins, or when it's just about to begin, he's already talking about the vanity of physical battles, and the much higher theme and the much more important theme of the power of poetry to express truth, which he repeats in Book 9 of Paradise Lost. He says he's not going to talk about wars and knights jousting and so forth. He has a better theme than that, and a grander one. So I think there's a consistency. I just wanted to note that. There's not, because I think there is a tendency to read Milton's Paradise Lost as being changed by the loss or the fall of Cromwell's government and his own house arrest and his own blindness, and now he's a pitiable old man. And he's given up, he's changed his theology perhaps even. And undertaken a grand retreat, but this, at least by the lights of this poet, it does not seem so. So, captain or colonel or knight in arms, whose chance on these defenseless doors may cease, if ever deed of honor did thee please, guard them, and him within protect from harms. He can requite thee. He can requite thee, for he knows the charms that call fame on such gentle acts as these, and he can spread thy name o'er lands and seas, whatever clime the sun's bright circle warms. Who is he? He, a reference to himself, I think. You want honor through military deeds? I can give you greater honor than that. by the virtue or by dint of the pen being mightier than the sword, as it said in English proverb. Milton holds to that. And he's already expressed that in Areopagitica, right? The importance of writing and of speech. Never mind politics. Never mind wars. What lasts is first of all, what God ordains, and also where men's hearts lie in relation to that. You can break their bodies. Can you bend their spirits and their wills? The poet can, by persuasion, conviction of truth. And so he sees himself as representing a more important battleground, if you will, and sees himself as the one of the muses chosen. Lift not thy spear against the muses' bower. The great Emathian conqueror bids spare the house of Pindarus. So if you're going to overrun the city, spare my life. And now he's using classical examples of when this happened. Pindar, the great writer of odes in the Greek world, was spared by Alexander the Great, even though he conquered Emathia, or Thebes, which revolted against his reign. He came in, conquered the city, and put them to the sword. He saved Pindar, the great poet. Likewise, Euripides, when Athens was sacked, was saved, spared, because of the recognition of the importance of the writer. Very interesting, and it says something about in the ancient world about the reverence held for not only poetry, but for the truth, across battle lines, across the lines of countries and something. So an appreciation for the muses, for the arts, for goodness and beauty and truth. Contrast that with the modern world, in which, let's say in Soviet Russia or in totalitarian regimes, they first go after the poets and the intellectuals. They're the ones that first get the bullet. They don't. Taking the city is easy enough. Where the way you really kill a country is you go after the writers and take them out so that their voices are silenced. And there can be no recovery. It's like salting the earth, the scorched earth policy. We're not trying to hold on to what's good, we're just trying to flatten everything. Anyway, comments or questions about Sonnet 8? I'm not going to go through them all because there are too many. You'll note that we have 9 and 10 here, but we have one in Ephagia eius sculptorum, written in Greek. Let's look to, what sonnet should I do here? Do you have any choice? Do you have any preferences? Let's do 9, firstly. A little different. Lady, that in the prime of earliest youth wisely hath shunned the broad way and the green, and with those few art eminently seen that labor up the hill of heavenly truth. The better part with Mary and with Ruth chosen thou hast, and they that overween and at thy growing virtues fret their spleen, no anger find in thee, but pity and ruth. Thy care is fixed and jealously attends to fill thy odorous lamp with deeds of light, and hope that reaps not shame. Therefore be sure, thou, when the bridegroom with his feastful friends passes to bliss at the mid-hour of night, hast gained thy entrance, virgin wise and pure. Note the lady here, just like the lady in Comus, is recommended for her chastity, for her virtuous life. Unlike the lady mentioned in Song of Solomon, as Shawcross notes, who unwisely and unsuccessfully looks for her Lord in the broad ways, right? She sticks to the straight and narrow. She's not being seduced by the world. You can talk about further, although I don't think it's explicitly referenced here, in Proverbs to the two women we meet. Wisdom cries out in the street, so does the harlot. This lady is wise in the sense that she is living a righteous life. She knows the threat to her. And she does it even from earliest youth. You could see it as a reference to the Virgin Mary. I don't think that that's explicit here either, but it would be a fit illustration. It's certainly the one that is explicitly referred to in line 5. The better part with Mary and with Ruth. Or you could think of Mary not as the mother of Jesus, but rather of Mary as opposed to Martha. Mary who sits at Jesus' feet rather than fussing and making sure that everything's taken care of, who's then rebuked by her sister Martha for being lazy when she's just sitting at the Master's feet, and Jesus praises Mary because she's chosen the better part. Could be. Both possible. As we know, Ruth chose to follow Naomi, her mother-in-law of her deceased husband, and followed her advice, and ended up being the progenitor of Jesus himself as a consequence. Extraordinary. Left her people to become part of Naomi's people. by marriage to Boaz. Right? Extraordinary. Mentioned in the genealogy in Matthew's gospel right at the beginning as a scandalous act to some degree. A woman associated with, that's not the scandal, it's the fact that she comes from the pagans. Remember, she's a Moabite. These are the enemies of Israel. So God is, if you look at Matthew's gospel, it's beginning by talking about the account of the genealogy of Christ going back to Abraham, the people who've lived by faith. But here we have a woman she's not even an Israelite. She's taken from the Moabites, yet God has used women throughout history. They name 5. One of them is actually not an Israelite at all, other than through her own faithfulness to God and also to her mother-in-law Naomi. So associations here. Chosen thou hast, and they that overween at thy growing virtues fret their spleen, no anger find in thee, but pity in Ruth. They find nothing to, as much as they would like to find fault in you, they can find none. They're angry, but they have no cause for anger. In the same sense that Jesus' opponents loathed him, were hostile towards him, but they found no fault in him. There was nothing they could say. All they did is reflect on their own wicked hearts. Likewise, the lady here. So note here, I said that the sonnet from a Petrarchan perspective is devoted to a lady, yes, but the lady in her physical beauty. There'll be a discussion of her eyes, her teeth, her hair, her complexion, her breasts, all manner of things, and stock comparisons. He doesn't bother with that. He goes to her virtue. It is about a lady, but now it's about her inner beauty. And her inner beauty is connected to her fidelity to Christ. right? So that's the octave. Again, it follows the same pattern as we saw the previous poem. And then the sestet, a little bit of a turn, and now talks about her actions. Thy care is fixed and zealously attends to fill thy odorous lamp with deeds of light. Again, a metaphorical action. And hope that reaps not shame. Therefore be sure thou, when the bridegroom with his feastful friends passes to bliss at the mid-hour of night, hast gained thy entrance, virgin wise and pure. So persist. And again, reference to the parable that Jesus gives about the wise virgins ready when the bridegroom will come in Matthew 25. So very biblical, but again, using the form of the sonnet and the conventions of it as a sort of a foil. Here's the way the world understands love and beauty. And here's the way God sees it. And Milton obviously inclines to the latter. Expresses it through the form of a sonnet. Characteristic of Milton's transformative Christian poetics. I talked about those models of Christ and culture. This is transformative. It uses the conventions, but it recalibrates them, makes them his own. Let me look at Sonnet 13. I think this is it. Is it going to be? Yes. This will be helpful because it'll refer to a work that we already read, namely that of the Masque, Comus, a Masque. The subject of the poem here, Henry Lawes, wrote the music to that. And so he's the one that Milton is addressing here right at the outset. And probably also, as it says, Shawcross notes for his poem Arcades as well, which we're not going to read on the course. And this sonnet was prefixed to a publication called Choice Psalms Put into Music for Three Voices. Anyway, Harry, whose tuneful and well-measured song first taught our English music how to span words with just note and accent, not to scan with Midas ears, committing short and long. Thy worth and skill exempts thee from the throng, with praise enough for envy to look wan. To after age thou shalt be writ, the man that with smooth air couldst humour best our tongue. So he's praising him for his virtuosity with music to fit the English voice. Remember, this is what, and so Milton sees Henry Lawes as something of a counterpart to himself in the art of Lawes in the realm of music, which Milton greatly esteems, he in the realm of letters, of poetry, and he's managed through his music to not break conventions, but adapt them so that they best suit the English voice. Remember, he talked about, even in his Of Education, about how English people tend to keep their mouths closed when they talk and they don't open them up and sing. But English, to this day, England is famous for its choirs, choral works. The reference, let me just read on. What am I doing? I interrupted the poem. Thou honour'st verse, and verse must lend her wing to honour thee, the priest of Phoebus' choir that tunest their happiest lines in hymn or story. Dante shall give fame leave to set thee higher than his Casella, whom he wooed to sing met in the milder shades of purgatory. So, lest we think that Milton might not have read Dante, it's quite clear he did. We did not think that beforehand. The reference to Midas's ears is a reference to a myth probably from, gosh, I'm not sure where this would be. I don't think it's in Ovid, but at any rate, King Midas's ears are turned to a donkey for declaring that Pan was a superior flute player, flautist, to Apollo. Bad idea. Never suggest that any creature is superior to one of the gods in any of the arts. Apollo is not happy. He is not pleased with this. If you need better ears, let me turn your ears to donkey's ears. Picked up by Shakespeare probably in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Bottom the donkey, can't hear, obtuse, lacks artistic appreciation. So he's attentive of lyrics, and what he's doing here, and this is a total an inter-artistic dispute. Should the music fit the lyrics, or should the lyrics fit the music? The tendency, and it's long existed, is to fit the words to a popular tune that already exists. That's what the English hymn writing tradition tends to do. There's a stock group of musical tunes, and they throw the lyrics into that framework. So the words have to fit the music rather than the music fitting the words, so that it's rendered singable. Now, the change in that is contemporary, what we call contemporary worship music, but perhaps I better not even get into that discussion, because that's chaotic. And the music, it still seems to me that they come up with the music and then the words will fit the music after the fact. It's just the music is not known in advance. And thus it's unsingable. Just by looking at it, you have to wait until the singer on stage has sung it a couple times, and then you can join in. Once you know it, you know it. But it's not predictable. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's going to suddenly speed up here, and then it's going to go down here, and then we'll go into a descant, and then we'll go over here, and it's literally up and down and unpredictable, chaotic. And the music leads the singing that way, it seems to me. Just purely, let me say one final thing on that, because I said it wasn't, and then I did. If Jesus is the Word of God, and words are the means that we best apprehend God with our if we say in our hearts that Jesus is Christ is Lord and announce it and speak with our lips, then we will be saved. There's something about the vocalization and the articulation through words of the worship of God. It's not primarily through music. In fact, music's not mentioned at all. Then it should be the words that lead the music and not vice versa. You may think that's a small point. I actually don't think it is, if we're trying to best praise God. But anyway, but you get the point here. He's devoting this to Harry, who understands that, and Milton, as a Reformation poet, appreciates somebody so attentive to lyric, that is the words, that he will adapt the music to the words rather than vice versa, and thereby stick closer to the truth as a result. And truth is, of course, Milton's preeminent concern. Thou honorest verse. You do honor to verse, and verse must lend her wing to honor thee. And the verse here is Donne's own sonnet. The priest of Phoebus's choir that tunes their happiest lines in hymn or story. Dante gave fame to a woman by the name of Casella in the Purgatorio. I'm going to give greater honor to you, because you're greater than Dante's. Musician. Musician that Dante, that actually existed in Dante's day, and Dante mentions her there in Purgatorio. Comments or questions about that? But again, it is an octave and a sestet, despite the way it's written out here online. Again, don't take the online representation of poetry to be the actual way that it was published. It's just, I think we're aware of that anyway, but should be said. And you can see it in our the published version here, that it's all together in one 14-line poem. Fifth Ode of Sort. Let's look at sonnet, if it's here. Oh, that's not the sonnet 12 here. Yeah, this is the problem with doing things online. This one's from 1647, so what might it be? No, that's not going to be it. Okay, well, this is more problematic than I thought it would be in terms of flipping back and forth. I have a lot of psalms. Let me go to Sonnet 15, page 227, with Fairfax, and to the Lord General Cromwell. Where's to Fairfax? You know, these might be better, but I don't see to Fairfax here, having said that. It was on the other page?
That's at the bottom under uncollected.
Ah, okay, thank you. Yeah, right you are. Right you are. And it is Sonnet 15. Okay, good. Lord Fairfax, the man to whom he's devoting this to, was the commander-in-chief of the parliamentary armies against Charles I, and led the parliamentary army to many victories. In fact, most think that had Fairfax not led the armies, that there would have been no victory, that the parliamentary forces would not have been able to defeat the royalists. However, having defeated Charles and brought him to his knees, as it were, he refused to participate in the execution. He would not do it. He thought that this was wrong. And so he withdrew from the whole affair, went into retirement, and then became a benefactor of, among others, Andrew Marvell, the poet Marvell, who lived on his estate and became, as I say, he patronized Marvell, and Marvell in turn interceded on Milton's behalf when Charles II returned. And because of Fairfax's pity for Charles I and his unwillingness to execute him, Fairfax, who was a great lord in the realm, Charles the son thought, I can work with him, and I want to reestablish the aristocracy. Will work with him. So Fairfax's voice had significant sway. Therefore, Marvell's did, and Marvell interceded on behalf of Milton. So it's not insignificant. But here he's writing to Fairfax as the commander-in-chief of the army. And we'll then go on furthermore up to Scotland, as I say, when the Scots rebel against the rule of the English because they're insufficiently reformed. Again, the Scots want them to be Presbyterians and insist that they be Presbyterians. Cromwell says, we didn't fight a war over liberty just for you to then impose a new type of ecclesiastical tyranny on us. We will have freedom of conscience in the realm of religion. Anyway, Fairfax, whose name in arms through Europe rings, filling each mouth with envy or with praise, and all her jealous monarchs with amaze, and rumors loud that daunt remotest kings. Thy firm, unshaken virtue ever brings victory home. Though new rebellions raise their hydra heads, and the false north displays her broken league to imp her serpent wings, oh, yet a nobler task awaits thy hand. For what can wars but endless war still breed? Till truth and right from violence be freed, and public faith cleared from the shameful brand of public fraud. In vain doth valor bleed, while avarice and rapine share the land. August 1648. Note for yourself again the consistency on Mr. Milton's part. There can be no victory actually won through physical battle. No genuine victory, no lasting victory. The great battles to be fought are against the enemies, the spiritual powers that oppose us. And they are chiefly conquered through the sword of truth. Remember in Ephesians 6, the armor of God, the full armor of God. Milton writes in full agreement with what we read there. It's not that there shouldn't be, he is not showing any contempt for Fairfax for having fought battles on the battlefield. These had to happen. Yet you know the most important battle has nothing to do with the victories that you win on the battlefield, but rather through your allegiance to truth. That's the end to which Milton directs Fairfax here in this poem dedicated to him, and again, consistent with his entire poetic oeuvre. Is that clear? The false north, I'm pretty sure that's a reference to Scotland. Yeah, they broke the Solemn League and Covenant when they went to support Charles I. Because Charles I offered the Scots Presbyterian government in their own land. And they said, okay, that's a good outcome. The English can have their Episcopalian thing. As long as in Scotland we're allowed to worship God aright, this is a good outcome for us. But the reference to Hydra heads, doubtless. No, we don't need to know what the Hydra is. We know what a Hydra is. But there's a nobler task, and there's the Volta. Oh, yet a nobler task. So there's the physical battle. You have triumph there, but there is a nobler task still to be undertaken, which is that of supporting true valor and true honor and true obedience, which is to God, who is no physical commander, has no physical armies, although he does have angel armies at his behest, which he can call upon. But the real battlefield to be won is that of human hearts, and they're won through truth, conviction, etc. I find the sonnets interesting. They're very simple. They're quite easy to understand, to access. What is most fascinating to me is the consistency of Milton's theme from beginning to the end of his life. So sonnet 15, that's a pretty famous sonnet. Well, let's look at 16. Is this Cromwell? Good. So Fairfax, we know, was the head of the Republican Army. Cromwell, on the other hand, was the leader and eventual leader of the new republic. Himself a minor nobleman, not as exalted as Fairfax, but becomes famed on the battlefield, is given credit for a number of signal victories over the royalist armies, and eventually is recognized in probably a similar way that George Washington was in the American, for his dauntless virtue, and as well as military victory. But again, above all, his character is what recommends him as leader, and that's why they put him forth. This is written after he has been installed as Lord Protector. So 1642, the other one was 1648. 1652, rather. Cromwell, our chief of men, who through a cloud not of war only, but detractions rude, guided by faith and matchless fortitude, to peace and truth thy glorious way hath plowed. And on the neck of crowned fortune proud hast reared God's trophies and his work pursued. While Darwin's stream with blood of Scots imbrued, and Dunbar field resounds thy praises loud, and Worcester's laureate wreath, yet much remains to conquer still. Peace hath her victories no less renowned than war. New foes arise, threatening to bind our souls with secular chains. Help us to save free conscience from the paw of hireling wolves, whose gospel is their maw, their mouth. Consistency of theme with his poem Lycidas again. So there are greater threats than physical threats. There are spiritual threats, and in particular in the realm of those that would defraud us of the gospel clarity and truth. And these you need to uphold and win as well. How will you win these fights? Not through censorship, but rather through allowing the truth to be written and published and to slay its enemies, just as he advances in his tractate Areopagitica, which we've seen already. That's what he means. This is a battle that needs to be fought and won, and is far more important than the ones that you've already won. And I'll read the little excerpt from Shawcross here. It's a very helpful footnote. 15 proposals were offered in March 1652 to the Committee for the Propagation of the Gospel by some of its members, recommending that the clergy be supported by the state. Spiritual matters, what Milton refers to our souls, would thus be subject to secular chains. Milton's weighing in on this. He does not want the ministers of the gospel to be paid from the public purse by the state. To maintain freedom of moral action, Milton believed no excess or undue manner of giving or taking recompense can exist in the church. The gospel should not be used for remuneration, nor should we listen to those who are thinking only of their own stomachs and pleasures. That's Shawcross's footnote, in keeping with what Milton's writing here, however. You have received freely, freely give. Don't let yourself be paid by the state, or you will be beholden to the state. These are what he calls secular chains. Secular, not in the sense of anti-Christian, but secular in the sense of this worldly. That's what seculum means. It's of this world, of this age. And the gospel is not only of this age, but the age to come. So again, it's directed to a sort of liberty. Psalms. It's really tempting to go through the Psalms, but let's go to Sonnet 18. Nope, it's not there, but it's here. Is it? Yes, it is. There we go. This is an occasional poem written, in other words, on the occasion of something happening. And the occasion is the Protestants, descendants of the Waldenses, living in the foothills of the Alps, who broke with the papacy. This is 12th century, so long before the Reformation, over their dogmas and practices. These are the Vaudois. So you can hear the French origin here. The Vaudois believe the Bible to be the sole guide to salvation. So we talk about the Reformation, we often associate it with this, but this group of believers believed that Scripture held full and final authority over believers' lives against the edicts of the papacy, even back in the 12th century. And the Duke of Savoy ordered the Vaudois to repudiate their descent and attacked them and slew them. Just like the Huguenots were massacred in France, 10,000 of them, and basically wiped out the Reformation in France with one stroke. 10,000 is no small number. And this persecution continued onward. So Milton is not only defending the Protestants in his kingdom, he's also talking about it in Europe as well. So it's a reference to the massacre in Piedmont, but as an indication of the types of things that are happening on the continent to this time. So it's a fellow Protestants. Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints, whose bones lie scattered on the Alpine mountains cold. Even them who kept thy truth so pure of old, even when all our fathers worshipped stocks and stones. Forget not, in thy book record their groans who were thy sheep, and in their ancient fold slain by the bloody Piemontese that rolled mother with infant down the rocks. Didn't just kill the adults, but the children. Their moans the vales redoubled to the hills, and they to heaven. Their martyred blood and ashes sow o'er all the Italian fields, where still doth sway the triple tyrant, that from these may grow 100-fold, who having learnt thy way, early may fly the Babylonian woe. So he sees this, and he uses quite explicitly, he explicitly refers to biblical language and themes, specifically that of Revelation. And this is given aptly here and again in our translation, or rather our edition, Revelation 6 verses 9 to 10. And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held, and they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? And so he defends the position that's been in the Church Catholic from early days, such as Tertullian, who says that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. It's sown here. You cannot defeat the word of God. Even though you slay those that hold to it, it will advance in ways that you're not capable of stopping. And he says that it was the case in Europe long before it came to Britain. Before the Reformation came to Britain, it was found in the northern Alps, or the southern Alps in Italy, Piedmont. Back when the British worshipped stocks and stones, in other words, they were pagans, wood, like the natives of this country. And the whore of Babylon being referred to here is the Pope. Likewise, as in the triple tyrant referred to here, is the Pope, who is identified regularly by virtually all Protestants, including the Anglicans, being the Antichrist. And you can see the footnote. Others have suggested alternatives here, but I think the most obvious one is the triple crown instead of his bishop's mitre. He's got 3 crowns. Again, not just for his immoral actions, although all pretty much acknowledge the immoral actions of the Pope, but for the way in which he changed doctrine and claimed to have authority over what doctrine taught, even when he explicitly taught against the justification by faith which Scripture upholds. So it's really an appeal to authority. Who has the keys over the church? Lots of discussion between Protestants, Catholics on this very issue. When Jesus gives the keys to Peter, does he mean that henceforward that Peter should be able to define what Christian truth is? And that the Pope, who claims to be the successor of Peter, thereby can publish edicts that will effectively stop the mouth of the gospel. That's the charge, and therefore he is the triple tyrant, because he suppresses freedom. Let me come to 19, one of his more famous ones. This one's later, and you can tell that it is. Probably, again, he puts it's a question mark in our edition here, 1655, not so sure. But before he writes his grand poems, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, etc., he's still in Cromwell's government, but he's lost his sight. And when we think about everything we've heard thus far about Mr. Milton and his belief that he had been called explicitly, specifically by God to write an epic of the English people, and he had not yet done it, and had distracted himself with earthly, secular duties, such as defending Cromwell's government, which obviously he believed was worth doing, but still, now his sight is gone. What do you think at this point? When I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days, in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve therewith my Maker, and present my true account, lest he returning chide, doth God exact day labor, light denied, I fondly ask? But patience to prevent that murmur soon replies, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state kingly. Thousands at his bidding speed and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. So he is directing this at two things. One is the obvious fact that he is now 50 odd years of age, and he has not yet done the thing which he believes most ardently he was called to do, and thereby to some degree may be considered in God's sight to have broken his trust and his faith, been unfaithful. Just like the servant who hid his talent because he feared the Lord's wrath. Has he hidden his talent? And the answer is clearly no, because as he says at the end of line 4, my soul is more bent to serve therewith my Maker, even though I've lost my eyes. So that hasn't changed. What is within me remains just as ardent, if not more ardent, despite my loss of vision. So the loss of my vision does nothing to change that, although some might think it might. That's the end of it. He knows otherwise, and knows that he still hath to. But then he addresses the issue at hand, which is that, and here he to somewhat resigns himself to the fact that he may not write the grand poem. You don't have to write the poems of God to serve God, because you can serve God by nothing other than standing, like it says at the end of Ephesians 6, that armor of God. After you've done everything, so you put on this armor, you put on the helmet, salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the sword of truth, the shoes of the gospel, etc. And then what do you do at the end after you've done everything? Stand. It's not, you don't even fight, you just stand. And that's what he's referring to here, implicitly. They also serve who only stand and wait. So he's still serving him, although he appears to be doing nothing. Seems to be powerless. Interesting. So if he writes this in 1655, again, it's speculated when it was written, not entirely clear. He stands and wait. How many years? A few, several years. And then gets arrested and has the opportunity to write the poem. And again, I say he doesn't write it, he dictates it to his daughter. But he did it because he didn't lose faith. He did not lose hope. He knew he was still serving God by doing nothing. Very important. Here's one of the hardest lessons when you're young, is to be patient. Milton is a good example of patience. Lots of other ones, obviously, but he certainly. Any comments, questions, observations? This one's particularly, obviously, he talked to Fairfax, he talked to Henry Lawes, he talked to Cromwell. Now he is addressing himself. And this is sort of a Renaissance trope as well, the self-directed poem. He's thinking about himself. And why should he not? But in general, he doesn't. But this one is clearly autobiographical. And so people take great interest in it. Because in our age, we love to talk about ourselves and think about ourselves and think that we're all important, etc. Milton does not. But occasionally he will make self-referential comments, even in his poems. So in Book 3 of Paradise Lost, he will talk about his blindness again and how it has not impeded him. So it's shut out wisdom from one entrance, but it's allowed wisdom to grow in another way. And that's to some extent what he's talking about here even. Well, we'll look at that invocation of the Muse in Book 3 when we come to Paradise Lost. But here he addresses that same theme. So just bear that in mind. Finally, since we talked about his wife, I think this is nice. Where is this? Sonnet 23. Most think it's dedicated to his second wife, Catherine Woodcock. Remember, he married 3 times. Others think that it's referring to Mary Powell. That there's a scholarly debate. Remember, the first wife was a royalist. They didn't get along very well. Choice, for whatever reason, was not apt. He wrote about, publicly mused on the possibility of divorce and so forth. Got to be a little hard on the wife, you would have thought. At any rate, not sure. I'm not sure it matters per se. Maybe it does. At any rate, it is a reference to his wife. So he's dedicated to a musician, to a political figure, to a general, to himself. This is to his wife. Note, in each of the cases, all 5 of those that I mentioned, none of them is devoted to erotic love, as the Petrarchan Convention would suggest. All of them are devoted to theologically informed themes. They often begin very bombastically with a trumpet, and they end quietly. That's in keeping with his theme that the paradise lies within us. It's not a realm which we need to conquer, or a state of the world which we need to create. Methought, says Milton, I saw my late espoused saint brought to me like Alcestis from the grave, whom Jove's great son to her glad husband gave, rescued from death by force, though pale and faint. Mine, as whom washed from spot of childbed taint, purification in the old law did save. And such as yet once more I trust to have full sight of her in heaven without restraint, came vested all in white, pure as her mind. Her face was veiled, yet to my fancied sight, love, sweetness, goodness in her person shined so clear, as in no face with more delight. But oh, as to embrace me she inclined, I waked, she fled, and day brought back my night. Remember, we haven't yet got there. I was talking about it in another class. In Book 4 of Paradise Lost, Milton gives us an account of how Eve came about from Adam's side. We know about that in Genesis. Adam has the animals paraded before him. He names them all, and there's no help for him, fit for him. So what does God do? He puts Adam in a deep sleep and takes from his side Eve. He wakes up, and there she is. That's all that's said in the scriptural account. In Milton's account, in Book 4 of Paradise Lost, Adam has a dream. So he's put to sleep and he wakes up and he describes it as being a dream, and he sees this beautiful woman, and because he's disappointed all these animals, none of them are fit company for him, and finally he sees one and he is running for her. And he thinks that it's a dream, and it isn't. He wakes and actually it's the reality. Here it's the other way around. He thinks he sees her in reality, and then he wakes up from the dream and realizes actually she's still gone. Very touching. Again, picks up on the themes in his own writing, and to some degree speaks against the impression that he had no regard for his wife whatsoever, especially if it is actually Mary Powell, his first wife. And you can read more about that in the Critics if you want. Some even think that he's not talking about his wife at all, but rather some ideal mate. And I think that that is not particularly plausible. I think he is directing it to a person and not some sort of idealization of a woman he's never met. His Eve, as it were. It's his late espoused saint. I mean, I just think that doesn't hold water. The reference here to Alcestis, Apollo intervenes, and Admetus, Alcestis's husband, is allowed longer life when she consents to die. And Hercules intercedes and stops death and restores Alcestis, who is in a veil, to her husband. So the death, by the way, in Greek is thanatos. If you've seen the Marvel movies, Thanos, it refers to death. This is thanatos. In both cases, references to death. But there's a sort of a mythological story here, and Milton is using that story here to give the references in relation to his wife. But again, with biblical themes here, serving the old law, grace, mercy, gospel, etc. I think, I've run over time. But again, you see the waking and sleeping theme. Again, I think you see a consistency of themes and preoccupations, very much departure from Petrarchan type of poetry, not bombastic the way Donne's are. In Donne's, it's the battle between the soul and sin and God. It's a real pitched battle. It's full of blood and thunder. That's Donne's holy sonnets. Milton has a much quieter, more confident faith than Donne ever did. Donne seems anxious. Milton is not anxious about such matters, of his salvation, etc. Quietly confident, and that's how he concludes the poems. Anyway, done for now. So next time,